Now, over the past couple of years, I like to believe that I've covered all of the major concerns I've had with the current landscape of AAA gaming. I've talked about the issue of game ownership, the death of physical media, video games coming out incomplete, live service and persistent online requirements, and to a lesser extent, some of the problems that we may experience in the future with video game emulation. However, something else that I haven't tackled despite being a very persistent problem is the issue of game optimization. Now, the reason for why I haven't gone in depth with this subject is because my stance is a bit more nuanced, and what I believe to be the source of the problem isn't exactly the same as everyone else's. So here's the thing, I'm not someone who's massively enthusiastic about video game graphics. To me, a video game having the highest polygon count and most realistic visuals doesn't improve my experience that much, nor is it even something that I necessarily seek out in video games. I know it's a cliche to say this, but to me, art style matters more than graphics. Realistic visuals can improve the art style in some games, but it's not a requirement for me to appreciate or even prefer the visuals. So because of that, when I see many of these cutting edge technologies like Unreal Engine 5, ray tracing, path tracing, mesh shaders, or Lumen, they're interesting to test from a technology enthusiast viewpoint, but they're not desirable to me from a gamer's perspective. Because of that, if you were to ask me what I believe to be a solution for fixing the issues of game optimization that we're currently experiencing, my honest take would be to just simply look back at games released for the 8th generation of consoles. Games such as Red Dead Redemption 2, Last of Us Part 2, Uncharted 4, the Resident Evil remakes. They're all games that I would argue reach the peak of how far video games can be realistic. It's been 4 years since the PS5 and the Xbox Series X came out, and since then I have not found a single game that has demonstrated a significant uplift in graphical fidelity to warrant a lot of these cutting edge, expensive technologies. I'm going to be the most charitable right now and use two examples of Nvidia sponsored games, which are often referred to as the games that look the most visually impressive by a lot of people, which is Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk 2077. Now, by no means am I insinuating that these games don't look visually appealing, because they definitely do. But even then, when I look at these games at their highest graphical presets with the most expensive RTX cards, the most that I could say about these games is that they look like beefed up 8th generation games. It's not that I believe that 8th generation consoles can run these games, that's completely ludicrous, but at the same time, when I compare the graphical uplift between the PS1 and the PlayStation 2, and between the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3, it just doesn't feel the same. It really doesn't. But like I said before, graphical fidelity isn't a major priority for me, so if the only issue I had with modern gaming was simply the fact that graphics are evolving at a slow rate, then I honestly wouldn't even be making this video. I'm very much open to the idea that, yeah, graphics after a certain while will peak in quality and may not evolve at a fast enough rate as it used to before, and I can very much live with this. However, where it starts to become a real problem is when graphical fidelity isn't evolving at the same rate as the cost to rendering it. Now, every once in a while, I often see people spreading around system requirements of certain video games before they come out in order to ridicule them for how demanding they are. However, I'm going to be completely honest with you, and this is where I know a lot of you will massively disagree with me. A lot of the system requirements listed in these games are actually not that unreasonable. More often than not, AAA developers design their games largely around the specifications of the consoles they're releasing for, partially because of stricter certification on the part of Sony and Microsoft, but also because they are mainstream gaming devices that a lot of people have. So the PC version of the game that you will see is going to be largely based on the build designed for the consoles that they're releasing for. For example, let's look at Monster Hunter Wilds. Now, on paper, these system requirements look bad. But the more you think about them, the more you realize that on paper, they actually make total sense when you consider that this is a current gen game, meaning that it's not a cross-generation game. An example of a cross-generation game would be Resident Evil 4, and when you look at the minimum requirements, it shows the Ryzen 3 1200 as the required CPU to run the game, the 1050 and the RX 560 as the required GPU, and 8GB of system RAM. I would actually describe these specs to be a little bit higher than the PS4, maybe even notably higher, but it's also much lower than the PS5. In fact, it's only in the recommended section where the game starts to advise hardware specifications that somewhat resemble the PS5, at least in terms of the CPU and RAM. But if you look at Monster Hunter Wilds, even in the minimum requirements, they are recommending the Ryzen 5 3600 and 16GB of RAM, so already jumping straight into the ball curve of the PS5 hardware. In the recommendation section, it's even more straightforward. Let's look at the processor requirement, particularly on the AMD side of things. It says that it recommends the Ryzen 5 3600X or the 5500, so basically at bare minimum you need to have an Hexa-core Zen 2 CPU, which is what the PS5 more or less has. It's actually octa-core, but it's fine because it doesn't fully utilize all the cores anyway. Now let's look at the graphics. They're recommending the RTX 2070 Super and the 6700 XT, which I would argue it's a little bit more powerful than the PS5, but they're very comparable, as the PS5, discounting the memory bandwidth, is equivalent spec-wise to the 6700 non-XT. So in the end, the only aspect of the sheet that is truly egregious is the fact that it requires frame generation to run at 60 FPS. So in my opinion, the real issue isn't so much the system requirements themselves, they're just simply reflecting the specs of modern hardware found in mainstream gaming devices, which these games are designed for. However, what I believe is truly the main issue here is the fact that with these games, the graphics just simply don't pay off. And not even just graphics, the physics, mechanics, the level of interactivity in the game, they're just not evolving. Meanwhile, our expenses are, since we now have to spend more money on more expensive hardware. For example, if you're someone who bought an RTX 3070 or even a 4060, there's a very real chance that your GPU might become obsolete with certain games at certain settings due to video games now having higher VRAM requirements as a result of the PS5 high bandwidth unified 16GB RAM pool, and this is in spite of the fact that both these cards, especially the RTX 3070, was more than good enough for running games at 1440p when it came out. Many of which are games that I would argue could trade blows with some of these 9th generation games as far as visuals. Now of course, that doesn't mean I don't think there aren't games that really are poorly optimized. Trust me, they do exist. There are definitely some games that are very inefficient with how they handle data cache. There are games that have really wonky engines that do weird things that are beyond my field of understanding but are clearly creating some performance penalties. These are definitely problems. But to be honest, I think the real issue is that these new rendering solutions are not meaningfully improving the graphical fidelity. The only thing that they're really doing that only really benefits the developers and not the players is the fact that it likely automates a lot of the rendering work compared to traditional techniques, but with how expensive they are, we're not yet seeing the benefits of them. I think it also doesn't help that a lot of these new technologies have additional band-aids that attempt to minimize the performance costs, but only ends up deteriorating the visuals. Now, I have no particular animosity towards upscalers like DLSS, XeSS, is that what it's called? I don't know, FSR. I know a lot of people have developed a ton of grudge towards upscalers because they're being perceived as excuses for developers to not optimize their games. But I personally have no ill will towards developers relying on upscalers, especially once we start to target higher resolutions. In my opinion, I think it's very inefficient to natively run games at resolutions like 4K. That's just so much. I'm not even just talking about GPU utilization, I'm also referring to the literal power draw. I've had so many instances where running certain games at 4K required my GPU alone to consume up to 300 watts. All of which just for the sake of rendering more pixels, when you can instead just render it at a lower resolution, have some GPU resources remaining that can be allocated to other tasks, and then use an upscaler that can allow the image to closely resemble the resolution it's targeting. However, I do think that upscalers are only really viable for higher resolutions like 4K, and this is where I think the main issue lies. Is that sometimes developers will require you to run games at 1080p using an upscaler, which means that the internal resolution will be something lower, and since the upscaling algorithm has less pixel data to work with, it will not do nearly as good of a job upscaling the image, and this isn't an issue that's exclusive to upscalers. I think even some of the anti-aliasing solutions, more specifically TAA, which has become an industry standard compared to multi-sampling anti-aliasing, it adds less burden on the GPU, but it also makes the image look blurry. And the problem with running games with internal resolutions below 1080 or even 720p in some extreme instances, plus adding a blurry anti-aliasing solution on top of it with a lot of shimmering, is that a lot of these games weren't really designed with these low resolutions in mind. If I play a PS2 game at 480p or 576i, while yes, it will look very pixelated, we are talking about very low resolutions, especially in high resolution screens. In general, they'll still look visually adequate because their art style had those resolutions in mind. Modern games are not designed with 540p in mind, so no matter how good the upscaling algorithm may be, the image will still look blurry and noisy, which can be even more amplified when you enable ray tracing. In fact, ray tracing is its own rabbit hole of disappointment. I'm just gonna be completely honest with you. I think ray tracing is one of the most useless features out there. I actually remember watching a video from Digital Foundry talking about the ray tracing implementation on Elden Ring, and I actually thought the game looked better without ray tracing. Look, let's be real here, path tracing is the only thing worth discussing, or at least I would say that, except this technology is so computationally expensive that even the 4090 struggles to run games with path tracing. And even then, I would argue that path tracing tends to make a more noticeable difference in older games. When compared to modern games with more mature rasterization, the improvement in graphical fidelity is visible. I'm not trying to act as if it doesn't exist, but still not enough to justify the GPU cost. In my opinion, in the current landscape of gaming, neither ray tracing nor path tracing is desirable. Only the people with the strongest NVIDIA hardware can even consider using this feature, which even then, you really have to look in yourself in the mirror and ask if obtaining marginally more realistic graphics is more important to you than getting higher frames. And everyone that I know just simply believes that ray tracing is not worth it. You know, there is this one comment that I found in a YouTube video that I was watching that perfectly illustrates how I feel. Modern gaming, ray tracing, noisy, resolution, blurry, frame rate, fake. And you know what's the worst part in all of this? Is that I don't think this is an issue that's gonna go away with this generation of consoles. Because I think a lot of this is a result of the current hardware just not being powerful enough to catch up with these modern engines and rendering techniques. Or at the very least, and there's no other way to put it, the developers may just not be talented enough to tune their games. I mean, let's remember that GTA 5, a game that I would argue is still comparable to a lot of new games as far as world rendering, quality of NPC, and density. This was originally a 7th generation game. At one point, this game was running on a gaming device with 512 megabytes of RAM. Yet fast forward to today, we're crying about running out of RAM with $400 gaming cards. If you ask me, at least during this current generation, there are two things that need to happen. For starters, I think graphics should just be put to the side. Again, we've already peaked with the PS4, arguably even the PlayStation 3 generation. Instead, we should try to push the boundaries with the depth of video game design. For example, Shadow of Doubt is a game that can be a little bit pushy with your hardware, but it has very little to do with the game's graphical fidelity. As you can see, it's a pixel art animated video game. What truly makes it demanding is the fact that it is a procedurally generated game with a lot of depth in the amount of puzzles, forensic data, NPC, multiple choices. To me, this game is much more generationally impressive than any ray trace game out there. I mean, I would also argue that even visually this looks a lot better than most of the AAA games out there. It's this kind of stuff that I want to see my hardware being used for. I also think there needs to be more games that recognize their limitations. For example, Stellar Blade. Despite being a 9th gen exclusive game, I wouldn't exactly describe this as something that's far beyond what I would expect from a PS4 game. It's an Unreal Engine 4 game. There's nothing all that insane and groundbreaking technology-wise about the world rendering and the combat system, and it didn't really need to be that. All it needed to be is a fun, addicting, good-looking, and well-sounding action game, which it is. And not only that, it has pretty respectable graphical modes. Performance mode runs at 1440p with a consistent 60 FPS, and if you want higher visual quality, you can play with an upscaled 4K that targets 60 FPS or native 4K at 30 FPS. The game didn't need any ray tracing, no Unreal Engine 5 nonsense. It knew what it needed to be in order to be a fun, stable game, and it achieved that. Sometimes, it almost feels like video games are dragging themselves down for no reason. I mean, Jedi Survivor was a game that when it came out, it ran like garbage. And yet nowadays, not only can this game run at 60 FPS on the PS5 and Xbox Series X, when it previously couldn't, but they were also able to port this to the PS4. And for getting the game to run at 60 FPS, all they needed to do was to just simply tone down some of the ray tracing and water down some things here and there that unless you're Digital Foundry and counting every pixel, you're probably not even gonna notice or care about any of the graphical regressions. However, while this is the approach that I wish more AAA developers would take, unfortunately I don't think this is the direction that they will take, because I think they've dug themselves too deep into this rabbit hole of graphical fidelity and cutting edge technology. A lot of people expect AAA games to be pushing graphics. There's this sort of mainstream demand for generational uplifts in graphics, and I think when these consoles first came out, they had a vision for what this generation would offer, like with the Matrix Tech demo, but I think over time everyone started to realize that these cutting edge technologies that we're trying to push to gaming are just not feasible for current hardware, especially as more people expect to be playing at 60 FPS. But instead of acknowledging this and relying on more traditional rendering techniques, there's this insistence on pushing the limitations. Like, these developers would rather deteriorate the experience of your game with unstable frame rates, ruin the image quality with shoddy anti-aliasing solutions, and reduce internal resolutions being algorithmically upscaled, all for the sake of what? Noisy ray tracing, blurry resolution, fake frames. This is what's supposed to define the ninth generation of video games. I think developers really need to reconsider their design approach, because this shit is not gonna get any better. But I know they won't, because these developers are fucking zombies. I also think there's a bit of artificial novelty going around between GPU and console manufacturers, in which they're trying to condition the player base into buying their latest hardware, with the selling point being that they're able to run these cutting edge rendering techniques regardless of whether or not it's actually intuitive to do that. So they'll often push these AAA developers to include these features. So at that point, I would just say play indie and AA games, because at least they're not as guilty of this. Anyway, following this, I'm pretty sure I've covered all of the concerns I have with modern gaming. I don't think the current AAA gaming landscape is sustainable. There's too much money getting dumped to sinking holes, so there's nothing I can do besides just stop supporting the industry and hope it'll crash. At least the AAA sector. But anyway, I think that's all I have to share. Take care.